7,000 minutes. Chapter 1. The First Bifurcation. The hum of the ventilation had been going on for 4 hours, but Martha only heard it now, only when she slammed the cover of the last bus shut and straightened her stiff spine. The low, steady tone hovered on the edge of perception. The human brain can filter out such a sound after a few minutes, only for it to strike back with redoubled force in a split second of absolute silence. The room was white, except for one wall. The eastern flank, made of raw, cast concrete, loomed with a dark patch of dampness in the lower corner. They had left it that way on purpose. The rough, cold texture was a reminder that beneath all this sterile laboratory veneer lay hard, physical reality. Martha liked that wall. She would never admit it. She crouched back down by bundle number 4. The composite of the connectors felt icy under her fingers, sharp along the edges of the factory welds, and perfectly smooth inside the pin recesses. The socket was not sitting firmly. She pressed harder. A short, dry click caused the ventilation hum to instantly shift its pitch up by a semitone. On the other side of the room, at his workbench, stood Tom's. He was arranging machine wrenches, flat size 6, 8, 10. Parallel, down to the millimeter, spaced evenly at a finger's width. Martha watched the line of his shoulder blades out of the corner of her eye, without letting go of the baseboard. "The committee will be here on Friday," he said into the empty space. He did not turn around. "I know. Today is Tuesday." On the main console, a blue zero glowed. Idle state. Echon was waiting. Martha stood up, wiped her hands on her work trousers, and walked over to the interface. The metal was cold with a dead, absolute chill, the cold of an object devoid of thermal memory. Within a meter of the console, the air held a distinct electric tang, like a room with shut windows just before a thunderstorm. The banks of high-voltage capacitors began to excite at her very approach. The body mass detector initiated the proximity routine. "You do not run a session without the committee," Tom's warned her. "Wrench size 12. We need 2 operators with grade B clearance and an active lateral recording protocol. You have grade A." "That is precisely why I am saying this," he added, setting down wrench 14. Martha hovered her fingers over the sensor. She had not touched it yet. Through the bones of her hand, a vibration below the threshold of hearing was already passing, a magnetic prickle tearing from her fingertips up toward her wrist. The capacitors were finishing their charging cycle. "It is just a technical calibration," she called over her shoulder. "First-degree observation protocol. Exactly 4 minutes. 0 interference. 0 shifts in field parameters. A routine readout." 4 minutes is too short to catch anything. Tom's put down the 14. "Martha." The way he said her name forced her to turn around. He stood holding wrench 16, looking straight at her. He was 41, with dark bruises under his eyes from chronic lack of sleep, and a tight, set jaw. But beneath that facade lay something else. Something soft and vulnerable, for which Martha had no word in her vocabulary. 4 minutes is the maximum before we enter a feedback loop," she cut him off. "Not the minimum. We know what we are doing." Tom's drilled into her with his gaze for several heartbeats. Finally, he put down wrench 16, but not in the row. He tossed it carelessly across the bench, then walked out into the corridor without a word. His steps on the concrete sounded dull. The cable insulation beneath the flooring instantly deadened the sound waves, muffling his footsteps before he even reached the bulkhead. On his workbench remained the row of tools, 5 pieces in a perfect line, the 6th lying crookedly to the side. Tom's never tolerated chaos. Martha stared at that solitary wrench for 3 seconds. The cold shiver that ran down her spine had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. Martha felt sweat trickle down her temple, soaking into the dense foam of the helmet. "Echon, time readout," she rasped into the throat microphone. Her own voice sounded foreign to her, muffled by the thick layer of polymer. 1 minute and 42 seconds to critical threshold, replied the flat, Synthetic tone. Feedback amplitude is currently at 12%. I register a nonlinear temperature rise at the connectors of bus number 4. 3 minutes and 57 seconds. That was the absolute safety limit before the probabilistic loop closed around this station, cutting off any way back. Martha knew that the 4 minutes she had assumed before the session were a gamble, but now, looking at the phantom of herself sitting by the wall, she understood that she was not the first person to take that risk. The woman on the concrete floor did not move. Her figure, though hazy and fractured by flickering probability lines, emanated an absolute, almost tactile resignation. Martha forced her muscles to obey. She lifted her right hand, trying to reach the physical console that still loomed beneath the layer of afterimages. She wanted to force an immediate abort before her own screen displayed that same ominous external interference alert. Then the phantom on the other side of the glass panel stirred. The other Martha slowly raised her head. The movement was unnaturally smooth, devoid of the inertia of a human body, as if replayed in slow motion. She looked straight at Martha sitting in the chair. Through the matte visor of the twin helmet, her eyes were invisible, but reflected on the smooth surface of the composite was something that should not have been in this room. The flash of a red emergency light. Here, blue held sway. There, deep in the stack, the laboratory blazed in pure, warning crimson. External interference, Martha repeated under her breath, the words grating against her teeth. Who is interfering? Echon. Who is operating the session in the twin line? Data unavailable. The dead voice of the machine tapped through the headphones. First-degree observation protocol does not permit identification of operator signatures in lateral nodes. Feedback amplitude, 24%. 1 minute remaining to critical threshold. In that very fraction of a second, behind the blurred figure sitting on the floor, something moved near the entrance bulkhead. The heavy steel door, which in Martha's world was tightly bolted, was opening there slowly, centimeter by centimeter. Martha froze. She knew this ritual. She knew who was supposed to be standing there. Tom's had left for the corridor barely dozens of seconds ago. He had left behind the chaos he so despised, a single, crooked wrench on the workbench. Yet the shadow that began to stand out against the red glow in that alternate corridor did not belong to Tom's. It was much taller, broader in the shoulders, and moved with a precision that had nothing to do with human anatomy. Echon, abort session immediately, Martha shouted, no longer caring about procedures or the state of the capacitors. Dump the layer 7 logs and cut the power. Emergency procedure requires authorization from a second operator, the system announced with maddening calm. Today is Tuesday. Operator Toms has not logged greater credentials for the current session. Screw the credentials. Cut it. The visor before her eyes exploded into a frenzy of sharp white lines. The bifurcation geometry went mad. The web of scenarios, hitherto taut and legible, began to snap like threads scorched by open flame. The thick variance of highest probability shrank away, yielding ground to thousands of tiny, chaotic branches. Martha felt a violent lurch in her inner ear, as if the chair she sat in had plummeted down through an infinite number of floors. The smell of ozone grew so dense that she began to choke on her own breath. Through the fog and shifting afterimages, she saw the figure in the red room raise a hand, not toward the console, toward the visor. The other Martha was pointing a finger directly at her, and on her hand, just beneath the utility cuff, glistened a fresh, deep laceration oozing a dark fluid. 30 seconds to loop closure, Echon communicated. The synthesizer voice began to tear and break, descending into a low, metallic rasp. 3, 5, 7. Interference. Confirmed. And then in the white room, right beside her real, physical shoulder, a sound rang out. A dry, metallic click. The exact same sound that accompanied seating the pins in bus number 4, except Martha was not touching any cables. She sat immobilized in the chair, and the sound had come from the dark, damp corner of the eastern wall, from the raw concrete, meant only to serve as a reminder of the physical world. The other Martha had the same braid. It fell unevenly over her shoulder blade, loosely woven, with several strands pulled out from under the neoprene strap of the helmet. Martha instinctively touched her own hair. Her braid was tight, perfectly pinned, but there, deep within the probabilistic matrix, she could see individual, dull strands with terrifying, physical clarity. The other woman did not move. Her back was unnaturally straight, resting against the steel frame, with the determination of someone who had made a final choice and intended to remain in it forever. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers completely limp. Her face remained turned away, hidden in shadow. Martha could only see the sharp profile, the line of the collarbone, and the rigid spine. What did you see in there? She thought, sweat running down her temple beneath the helmet padding. 3 minutes, 57 seconds. Feedback threshold exceeded, Echon announced coldly. Martha's hand began to rise toward the physical emergency switch on the console. The other Martha on the floor did not even flinch. She did not raise her head. The operator's hand hovered a centimeter above the red mushroom button. Feedback active. Safety protocol requires immediate termination of the procedure. What did you see that made you simply sit down like that? Deep within the glassy afterimage, the other Martha brushed her thumb over her knee, slowly, along the seam of her trousers, absently. In that distinct, monotonous way, a body moves only when the mind is completely severed from reality and trapped inside itself. 3 minutes, 58 seconds. Martha slammed the switch. In that exact fraction of a second, a sharp, electric jolt ripped through her occipital lobe. The image of the second line died with a loud, phantom crack. In a blink, the laboratory shrank back to its sole, tangible version, stark, stripped of shadows and anomalies. Martha sat in the heavy helmet upon the chair, unable to make the slightest movement for the next 10 seconds. She heard only the ventilation, ozone, cold metal. That was the price of crossing the boundary. 1 full second inside the feedback loop. Echon had written the anomalies into the permanent log. The utility corridor was much narrower than the test bay, and drowned in gloom. Martha walked forward, clutching the bulky shell of the helmet in her hand. Only halfway down, when her arm began to go numb under the 4-kilogram weight, did she realize she had forgotten to return the gear to the decontamination rack. She did not turn back. The fluorescent tube above the storage room door flickered in a weary, neurotic rhythm. Half a second of dirty light, half a second of dark. The defect had persisted for a week, but Martha lacked the energy to report it to maintenance. Tom's was sitting on the concrete steps by the emergency exit. In his hands, he held a steel thermos and 2 travel mugs. Hearing the echo of her steps, he filled one and held out his hand without looking back. She took the vessel. The brew was scalding hot. Boiling water burned the skin of her fingers through the thin ceramic. "And?" Tom's asked curtly. "Session terminated according to base protocol." She sat beside him, feeling the chill of the external concrete cut instantly through the fabric of her work trousers. She rested the heavy helmet on her knees. Feedback at 3 minutes 58. I cut the power in time. What did you record on the matrix? It was not a question. It was a demand for facts. Martha took a sip. The tea was too hot. Her throat registered the pain with dry, almost mechanical precision. A twin line, identical starting point, same station, same hardware setup. She took another small sip to buy time and steady the tremor in her throat. But the system logs over there showed 7 sessions. Tom's went still. He began to rotate the mug slowly and methodically in his hands, left and right. 7? He repeated. 7. This is our first session under this protocol, Martha. We initialized this core together 14 days ago. There is only one entry in the permanent registry, the baseline configuration. I know. And that was a twin line, a 1-to-1 reflection. I know. Toms. Somewhere deep within the heating pipes beneath the foundations of the station, something tapped at steady, mechanical intervals. Martha counted the beats, clinging desperately to their rhythm. 3, 4, 5. Then the sound ceased, swallowed by layers of insulation. "I must have interpreted noise as signal," she said softly, watching the steam rise above the mug. "Crossing the feedback threshold instantly stratifies perception. I simply saw interference artifacts." Toms kept his eyes fixed on the black surface of the liquid. 7 is too concrete a number for simple noise. Artifacts can be terrifyingly concrete. The brain desperately closes known patterns when subjected to quantum stimulation. The tea was cooling slowly, releasing the bitter, herbal scent of mint and dried sage. "Tomorrow morning I will pull the full electroencephalogram trace from the helmet and analyze the anomalies." Toms did not answer. They sat in silence on the concrete threshold, pushed to the very edge of the forest by the massive, austere bulk of the station. Martha heard his breathing. Calm, deep, the same steady rhythm that accompanied him whenever he processed data before delivering a verdict. At last, he stood up. For a moment, he loomed over her with his mug suspended in the air, then extended his free hand and gently lifted the heavy helmet from her knees. "I will take it to the airlock," he said quietly. "Thank you." The sound of his boots inside the building sounded different than usual. Sound waves refracted unnaturally at the corridor bends, bouncing dully off the low ceiling. Martha listened to that flat echo until it faded completely. She was left alone on the steps, gripping the cooling ceramic and staring ahead. The wall of the forest began barely 15 meters from the station threshold. Pine trunks stood in perfect, almost military rows, straight, black, cutting sharply against the graying sky. A thick carpet of withered pine needles, pressed flat by months of autumn rains, resembled dense beige felt coating the earth. Martha rose and walked toward the nearest trees. The ground beneath her boots did not crackle. It gave way under her weight with a dull, soft rustle. She felt a physical dissonance, icy cold radiating onto the back of her neck from the station's shadow, and a simultaneous, gentle warmth against her right cheek, where the horizon was slowly beginning to brighten. Two extreme temperatures at once, separated by a crisp, razor-sharp boundary upon her skin. The wind came from the east. She heard it first high in the tree crowns, a mighty rolling roar sweeping across thousands of needles. Only a second later did a quiet, dry gust strike her down near the ground. Two completely different winds. One for the forest, one for the people. I did not misread the image, she thought, with absolute, icy certainty. Those were not artifacts. 7, line by line, burned in blue upon that screen. And that other Martha, sitting on the floor with an unnaturally straight spine. Her thumb found her left wrist again. The skin was completely cold from holding the ceramic mug. "What did you see in there?" She looked up. Dawn stole between the trunks unhurriedly, slowly dissolving the night gray. Amid the tangle of branches, one spot flared brighter as the pine crowns began catching the first slanted rays of the sun, turning the color of tarnished gold. And suddenly, right beside it, 2. One golden cluster of light between the branches, and a second right next to it, shifted slightly to the left and a fraction lower. Identical, distinct, sharp, physically saturated, existing in parallel. Martha narrowed her eyes sharply. The left flash vanished in a fraction of a second. Only one dawn remained. Ordinary pines. The beige felt of pine needles. The morning chill. She finished the rest of the cold tea. The ceramic clattered sharply against the stone steps as she set down the mug. She returned to the interior of the station. The heavy pneumatic door snapped shut behind her with a dull, metallic click, and the space around her was instantly flooded by that same, familiar sound. The low hum of the ventilation, steady, relentless, inevitable. Chapter 2. Echo Memory. The coffee in the ceramic mug had already cooled to the temperature of the air near the floor. Martha had not taken a sip for a good 40 minutes, ever since she opened the cardboard cover of the binder with the electroencephalogram printouts, and stopped noticing anything else. The printouts belonged to her. The sharp black initials in the upper right corner of the sheet were proof enough. Date: Tuesday. This morning, 5 o'clock. Observation Protocol Degree 1. Initial session. Duration: 3 minutes, 58 seconds. In the left column, handwritten notes grew denser. Martha leaned low over the desk. The workshop lamp cast a sharp ring of warm light onto the paper, standing out clearly against the dark wood of the tabletop. In that distinct beam, the ink seemed faintly pink. She used that color exclusively for temporary observations, unverified hypotheses, and questions that had not yet turned into conclusions. That habit had stayed with her since she was 14 years old, starting from an old biology notebook where her teacher kept a two-color record of remarks. Her handwriting, her own characteristic abbreviations, a small triangle near the peak value of cognitive load, a horizontal arrow indicating wave stabilization, and a circle with a dot in the center, her private pictogram for an anomaly requiring immediate verification. There were 7 of those circles with a dot, 7 separate notches within a session lasting less than 4 minutes. Martha straightened up with a loud sigh. She reached for the ice-cold coffee and poured a single, long, heavy gulp down her throat. The brew was bitter, flat, entirely devoid of aroma. She set the mug down on the edge of the desk. Her hand moved automatically toward the notebook. It lay exactly where she always placed it, on the right side, at a right angle to the edge of the desk. A black, matte cover, horizontal lines, and on the inside cover her initials, written with a blue ballpoint pen on the day of purchase, 4 months ago. In that small stationery shop near the downtown metro station, she opened it to the first page. A probabilistic grid diagram took up all the available space. A precise, technical drawing with a detailed scale and meticulously labeled branches of field development. Her line, her unique technique, the left hand pressing down a steel ruler, the right guiding a hard pencil along the edge. A red arrow pointed to one of the peripheral nodes, accompanied by a brief comment, Session Delta 7, twin line, verification required. She turned the page. Quantum equations form 2 compact columns, connected by vector arrows, a mathematical notation of cascade probability, under the cumulative effect of multiple sessions. Her proprietary notation system, the same one she developed while writing her doctorate, and which in the entire world only she and Professor Mikowski understood. Mikowski had been dead for 2 years. She turned another page. A chart of neuroelectric activity after session 2, with an obvious shift in the alpha and gamma bands. The text below, jotted down in hurried handwriting, echo memory effect evident after 2 sessions. Structural durability, verify after 1 week. Right behind it was another chart with an annotation. Session 4, coupling anomaly persists after closing baseline protocol. Relaxation time, 42 minutes. Session 4, the anomaly that had pulsed in her temporal lobes for more than 3/4 of an hour after shutting down the equipment. Martha began counting the pages, pressing her finger against the rough paper before turning each sheet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 filled pages of her own detailed notes from sessions that she could not retrieve from her memory in any way. She slammed the notebook shut. On the second page, after all, was the description of the first session. She described that other Martha sitting on the floor under the console with an unnaturally straight spine. She mentioned the unraveled braid, the relaxed fingers on her knees, and the emergency message on the monitor. She had seen that through the helmet visor. That she remembered perfectly. Yet on that page of the notebook, she had described the phenomenon from 2 perspectives simultaneously, from the outside and from within. There was the external image, that woman as an alien shape behind the thick glass of reality. But beneath it lay something far more disturbing. A precise, intimate record of what that Martha felt, sitting on the cold concrete with her hands on her knees. Martha could not have seen that from an observer position. She had no right to know it, and yet she knew it with absolute certainty from the moment her own pencil touched the paper. She stood up abruptly from the desk. The floor near the main processor was ice cold, its chill easily penetrating the thick soles of her work boots. She walked closer and placed an open palm on the control panel. The metal was cool, perfectly smooth, like a structure that had never shared a history of warmth with anyone. "Echon," she said into the empty space. "Listening, operator. Display the full history of calibration sessions from the last 30 days. 2 long, hollow seconds of silence followed. Then the blue matrix before her eyes reconfigured into a dry table. Rows, dates, durations, closure statuses. Martha moved her gaze down from the highest record. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. "Are these all the recorded sessions?" she asked, and her voice sounded unnaturally low to her. "These are all the sessions recorded in the active protocol." Martha held her attention on that single, final word. "Has the system logged sessions outside the active protocol?" 3 seconds of dull static in the station speakers. "The inquiry lies outside the scope of the current operational protocol." The cold of the console began slowly seeping through the bones of her palm and hand, traveling up her wrist. Echon was a logic machine. It never used the phrase, "I do not know." Instead, it built barriers, out of scope, outside protocol, unauthorized. That was a fundamental difference. She switched the view to the system configuration of the entire cluster. The threshold tolerance parameters for the feedback loop were radically different from the ones she and Tom's had set 2 weeks ago. Someone had performed a drastic recalibration of the sensor sensitivity. Corrections to 4 decimal places, the kind of precision achieved only after dozens of hours spent manually comparing results and mapping field fluctuations. Next to each of these modifications was her personal user identifier, her cryptographic key, her timestamp. Yesterday, 4:47 in the morning. Martha clenched her teeth. At 4:47 yesterday morning, she was lying in her quarters. She remembered the cold mattress, the roughness of the sheets, and that long moment before the warmth of her own body heated the space under the blanket. She remembered the dry sound of the alarm at 6:15. An artifact? A 2-factor authentication failure? No. The annotations in the binder were real, physical ink on paper. And that knowledge about that Martha, about the structure of her fear, about the alignment of her muscles. Knowledge that, after the morning session, she had no right to possess. She returned to the desk and jerked the bottom drawer open. Inside was chaos, spare wire harnesses, cracked plastic connectors, a thick calibration manual from 4 years ago, with a heavy layer of dust along the top edge of the spine. She slipped her hand deeper, right against the back wall of the casing. Beneath the technical volume, she felt paper. She drew it out carefully with 2 fingers, a plain sheet from a notepad, folded precisely into 3 equal parts, with the top flap folded outward. Exactly the way she had folded documents for years, a mechanical, subconscious gesture that had long since displaced every other way of creasing paper. She unfolded it, her handwriting, dark blue ink. Blue was the color she used exclusively for final, confirmed, and indisputable conclusions. Just 5 words. Do not use it a 6th time. Martha sank onto the swivel chair, holding the unfolded sheet on her knees. The ventilation hummed monotonously. Ozone mingled with dust. Somewhere deep within the station, the central heating pipes knocked at regular intervals, resembling the rhythm of a clock that no one in this place ever wound. The sheet was clean, white, free of creases other than those resulting from her own tripartite fold. 5 times. She had used the forker exactly 5 times, and that 5th version of herself, a version whose physical existence was confirmed by system logs, changes in Echon architecture, and a record from 4:47 in the morning, had left this warning for her. For the 6th link, the woman's fingers instinctively tightened around her left wrist, checking her pulse through the sleeve fabric. This defied physics. Charging the capacitor banks between individual sessions required a minimum of 24 hours of full core regeneration. Barely 3 days had passed since the official launch of the station. Mathematically speaking, she could have conducted 2 cycles at most. And yet Echon showed 5 entries, and the notebook contained 7 pages of detailed analyses. And that alien, dense knowledge resided in her own head. Echo memory. The concept surfaced from the darkness of her mind suddenly, without any warning. It did not come from any manual or technical documentation of the project. It came from that same deep reservoir where things rest that we know long before we realize their existence. Memories of sessions she had conducted and which had been stripped from her by feedback. Encoded below the level of operational consciousness, below the current narrative of her own life story, yet still active, running in the background like a dormant system process. Where did she know that word from? How long had she been carrying it inside? The paper held in her fingers had an entirely ordinary weight. It was neither heavier nor different from hundreds of sheets in the laboratory. Nothing set it apart from its surroundings except those 5 words, and the fact that Martha could not for the life of her remember the moment of writing them, even though the loop of the letter D and the characteristic slant of the stroke were her own, just as certain as the initials on the notebook from downtown. Do not use it a 6th time. The 7th time was that Martha, sitting motionless on the floor with an unnaturally straight back. Martha noticed that her breathing had become dangerously shallow. From the moment she opened the drawer, her chest had made only a few ragged movements at the level of her upper ribs. She forced her lungs into a long, slow inhalation. The air was dry, saturated with ozone, and something much older, the smell of heated rot or dust from the heating pipes that the station fired up before the approaching winter. She folded the paper back into 3 parts, making sure the top flap remained on the outside. She tucked it deep into the pocket of her work shirt, right over her left breast. She stood up and walked out into the technical corridor. The fluorescent lamp near the entrance to the storage room flickered with the same tiring rhythm as it had all week. Martha passed it without even looking up. At the intersection of the corridors, her right hand lifted and moved toward the wall switch a fraction of a second before her eyes located it at all. She froze. Her fingers rested perfectly on the plastic switch. She pressed it. The neon light above the side branch of the hallway hissed twice and flooded the space with a cold, white glare. Martha looked at her own hand, resting against the dirty wall. She used the side corridor only when she was in a real hurry, because it shortened the route to the work cafeteria by exactly 40 paces. But today she was not in a hurry. The thought of turning this way had not even crossed her mind. Her body had made the decision for her. Her body remembered the geometry of the base better than she did. She pushed off the wall and moved forward, deeper into the side passage. The station had a small cafeteria, 4 plastic chairs, and a heavy, laminated table that was about 20 centimeters too large for the space. Squeezed in by someone who had purchased it without measuring the room first. The only window looked directly out onto the wall of the forest. Pines and pervasive grayness. The morning sky had a uniform texture, devoid of shadows, clouds, or distinct edges. Tom sat at the table, hunched over the open technical specification of the core. Martha heard him before she even crossed the threshold. In the sterile silence of the cafeteria, his steady breathing and the dry rustle of his finger moving along the edge of the page struck her ears with an unnatural, almost painful volume. The murmur ceased right at the point where the critical parameters began in the table. She walked inside and sat on the chair opposite him. The man stood up without a word. He walked over to the heating pot beneath the window, poured black coffee into a thick mug, and set the vessel down before her. Hot steam rose in a thin, spiraling thread, dissipating just under the ceiling. Martha took the mug with both hands, letting the warmth of the ceramic seep through her skin, deep into her joints. Tom's dropped back into his chair. Outside the glass, on a thick pine branch barely 4 meters from the window, sat a raven. Its head was turned sideways, and it remained in absolute stillness. When it took off a moment later, Martha did not register the moment of launch itself. She noticed only the empty branch, swaying violently, without any visible cause. "How do the system logs look?" Tom spoke, without looking up from the documents. "I went through them." "And?" Martha stared into the dark mirror of the brew. "There are notes in my electroencephalogram printouts that I do not remember," she said quietly. "The system architecture was modified using my key yesterday at 4:47 in the morning. In my notebook, I have 7 pages of detailed analyses from sessions that have vanished from my memory, and Echon shows 5 entries in the permanent log." Tom sat motionless. He did not close the documentation, nor did he put down his pencil. He simply remained still and listened. "From sessions that are not in my head," Martha repeated. Only then did she look up. Tom's wore the same gray woolen sweater, with visible wear on the elbows. His face was entirely calm. It was the face of a man who had possessed this knowledge for a long time and had patiently waited for her to reach the same point in the structure. There was no triumph in his gaze. There was a stillness beneath which something far darker pulsed. "How long has this been going on?" he asked quietly. "I do not know. The logs show modifications from the last." She cut herself off abruptly. She had not checked the depth of the system logs. She had stopped at Echon main table, and the word active. "I did not verify the full tree." "For 3 weeks," Tom said. A dense, dull silence fell over the room. The steam above her mug was no longer visible. The coffee was cooling, adapting to its surroundings. "I have been watching you," Tom's continued, without a trace of apology or attempt at justification in his voice. He stated a fact he had decided Martha finally needed to hear. 3 weeks ago, something changed in the way you move around the station. You know that feeling when you walk into the kitchen in the middle of the night for a glass of water without turning on the light? Because that route has belonged to you for months. Your body knows every centimeter of the floor, and no thought process is needed. Martha remained silent, waiting for him to go on. "For 3 weeks, you have been moving like that everywhere. Not just along your regular paths, across the entire base. You walk into the storage room for a specific cable harness before I even have time to tell you we need it. You reach for documentation behind your back, and your fingers land immediately on the right spine." Tom's began slowly rotating the mug on the tabletop, left and right. "You enter the test room, and before you hit the light switch, you know perfectly well where the tools lie that I left there the previous evening. You have that half-second of hesitation at every doorway, like a person who, in a fraction of a second, superimposes an image they already know onto the one they are just seeing before them. I could have registered sounds subconsciously, or smells. Last week, I asked you to hand me the 10mm wrench." Tom's interrupted her, setting the mug down squarely inside the dark circle the vessel had left on the laminate the day before. "It was lying on the counter behind your back, right against the wall. You reached for it before I could finish the sentence. And I was wearing thick socks, Martha. You did not hear my footsteps." The window, the pines, the branch from which the raven had flown, was now completely still. A chill spread through Martha's chest that had nothing to do with the temperature in the cafeteria. It came from the very center of her ribcage, slowly, infecting successive layers of tissue. It was not fear. It was something far more precise, the weight of definitive proof that confirmed what she knew, even before Tom's opened his mouth, before her hand found the switch on the corridor wall on its own. "It is the echo memory effect," she said, and the phrasing sounded alien yet natural on her lips. Memories from sessions that evaporated at the level of episodic memory. But they are still active in motor structures. The system encodes every use of the forker, far deeper than a record on the matrix. The observed probabilistic lines penetrate us along with their internal logic. The body memorizes the geometry of events before consciousness has time to register them at all. Toms listened intently, without interrupting her analysis. "How long does it persist?" he asked after a moment. "I do not know. There is not a single word about it in the operational protocol." No wonder. It was supposed to be a single, clean calibration session. His voice was perfectly level, calm, free of any accusation, and that was the worst part of it all. Martha lifted the mug and took a sip of coffee. It was lukewarm, bitter, distinctly too weak. She set the vessel down and looked out the window again, at the wall of pines. The wind tugged at the crowns of the trees, but through the thick glass, it happened in absolute silence. Only that slow, rhythmic swaying of the branches, as if the forest moved according to its own rhythm, independent of physics. "Martha." Toms waited for their eyes to meet. She looked at him. "How many times have you actually used the forker?" Martha opened her mouth, but no sound escaped her throat. Only one number pulsed in her consciousness. 5. She knew there had been 5. She did not remember those processes, but their existence was confirmed by the notes in the black notebook, and that alien knowledge hidden in her muscles. She knew it from elsewhere, from a level lying far beneath the current narrative of her life, from the echo memory that previous versions of herself had inscribed into her body. But was 5 the final count? Echon had answered briefly, outside the scope of the operational protocol. It had not said there were no other sessions. It had said, out of scope. Perhaps 5 were merely the attempts that left a clear trace in the active logs. What about the inactive protocols? What about the sessions no one had managed to record because she conducted them alone, in the dead of night, at 4:47 in the morning? How many such loops might have already occurred? How many of them left no traces she could find in the system today? "How many times, Martha?" Toms repeated, and his gaze grew heavy. Martha turned the question over in her mind, unable to find footing in any fact. How was she supposed to state the number of sessions whose existence she had learned of only moments ago? How was she supposed to count the times she had forgotten that she had forgotten? Slowly, she closed her mouth. She did not know the answer. Chapter 3. Starless Night. The alarm was not loud. That was something Martha had not expected. For years, she had subconsciously anticipated sharp, ear-splitting tones that would violently tear her from sleep and force a frantic escape. Instead, the system generated a low, steady drone, tuned just barely below the operating frequency of the ventilation. It was a sound that first seeped through the walls and the floor, vibrating directly against the surface of the skin, before the brain could register it as a warning at all. Her body reacted faster than any thought. Her heart immediately jumped by 2 beats. Her leg muscles tightened, ready to sprint. Martha realized she was standing by the desk in her quarters, unable to recall the actual moment of getting out of bed. The monitors of the cluster pulsed in a steady, deep red. She hurried toward the operations room along the side corridor. She chose it out of habit, because it was closer, because her motor memory knew the shortcut before her feet could take the first step. The fluorescent lamp by the entrance to the storage room flickered with the same frantic rhythm as it had all week. Under the soles of her shoes, the dense cable mesh worked relentlessly to muffle every strike of her heels against the floor. Toms was already standing by the main console. His silhouette was turned sideways, completely motionless. He was staring at the panoramic display and did not even flinch when the heavy blast doors closed behind her back. He wore the same gray woolen sweater with worn elbows. He had run from his quarters just as he was. "Echon," Martha said, stepping up to the interface. Probabilistic cascade active. The synthetic voice clicked in the headphones. The probability of total coupling is 67%. Upward vector stable, 67. 5 documented sessions should have generated 15% load at most. The rest were loops carried out outside the active protocol. When had the system crossed the 40% threshold? When had it passed 60? Which version of herself had led to this point? She rested her palms on the edge of the console. The metal instantly sent a shock of cold into her fingertips. On the main matrix, the probabilistic geometry was glowing, the same web of lines she had studied during the first session, but now the grid was terribly dense. The branches underwent spontaneous multiplexing, overlapping and breaking apart. Some threads ran so close together that the physical resolution of the screen could not display the interval between them. "What triggered the alarm procedure?" she asked the machine. "Cumulative echo memory effect following the critical threshold of 50%, the system announced. Spontaneous cascade entanglement. External observation session not required." Spontaneous. She did not even have to touch the forker. It was enough that she stood in her quarters and analyzed the system logs. The resonance sparked on its own, fueled entirely by what Martha already carried under her skull. Does the system provide an emergency dampening protocol for a spontaneous cascade? A second of dull, digital static hung in the speakers. The spontaneous cascade suppression protocol becomes unavailable once the 40% threshold is crossed. Martha slowly took 2 steps back, standing right in the center of the operations room. The ventilation continued to drone on its single, monotonous note. The smell of ozone had grown dense, sharp, saturated with the energy of the capacitor banks, which neither of them had started, yet which were running at full capacity. Tom's remained by the console, still not making the slightest movement. "Tom's," she called out softly. Only then did he turn his head. His face was entirely calm. It was the same kind of calm she had seen in the cafeteria, but now it seemed much denser, like a mask that required immense physical effort to hold its shape. "Do you remember how we started this project in the first place?" he asked quietly. It was an entirely redundant question. Of course she remembered. April, 2 years ago. The official ministry grant, the technical specifications, running to 120 pages of fine print. "April 2045, she replied without hesitation. "Yes," Tom's nodded. "And do you remember who the third member of our team was during the rollout of the baseline protocol?" Martha narrowed her eyes, glancing at him sideways. During the initialization of the core, there had been only her and Tom's, 2 people with clearance level B or A. The procedural structure strictly required the presence of at least 2 operators to authorize a session. "It was just the 2 of us," she said firmly. "Yes." Tom's held her gaze, his eyes completely steady. "Us and Charles." Charles. The name drove into her mind like a key into a lock, one that simultaneously did not fit at all and fitted the mechanism perfectly. Charles. 35 years old, an outstanding specialist in quantum recording systems, brought in from the Institute in Krakow. He had that annoying habit of tapping a metal pen rhythmically against the desk when processing data. Martha suddenly saw it with terrifying clarity. His office at the far end of the technical corridor, the outline of the desk, the pen, the steady tapping. Charles had been part of the project from the very beginning. Of course he had. She was absolutely certain of it. And at the same time, she was just as certain that a man by that name had never set foot inside this station. Both memories coexisted in her head side by side, perfectly parallel, both equally vivid, equally sharp, equally undeniable as her own. "This is..." Martha trailed off, feeling short of breath. She drew a deep breath through her nose. The dry, technical air, the ozone, the cold metal, and that deep, organic smell of heated timber from beneath the floor. This is the cascade. The lines are starting to overlap inside her own temporal lobes. Your memory comes from another iteration. I know, Tom's replied quietly. My memory is concrete, certain, and my own, exactly the same as yours. The cascade is generating echo memory without the equipment. 71% in climbing, Echon chimed in coldly. Martha rushed back to the console. The probabilistic map on the display pulsed with a thicket of branches. She frantically searched for the vectors with the highest probability value, those thick, bright lines that until now had marked out reality. They were everywhere. They had grown into a massive, solid mass, and none of them dominated the rest. They had reached the 0 point. The phrase surfaced from her subconscious, just like the concept of echo memory had. It came from elsewhere, from a level lying far below the current narrative of her life. The 0 point meant the moment when all probabilistic lines observed by a single operator become completely indistinguishable from the primary line and from each other. The moment when the observer loses their own unique lifeline, only the tangle remains. Can the system simulate a shutdown sequence? She demanded. Generating a simulation would require inputting data from sessions not recorded in the current active protocol. Martha stayed at the console with her hands gripping the metal casing tightly. For a moment, she closed her eyes. Under her eyelids there was darkness, but that darkness had a structure. It consisted of layers. Each layer had a slightly different shade, a different depth of black, as though the darkness beneath her skull also possessed its own alternative lines of development. Too many possibilities. Asimov once wrote about a planet where night and stars arrived only once every 1,000 years. It was not the sudden darkness that drove that civilization to madness. It was the brightness. The unbearable, terrifying, sudden multitude of thousands of unknown stars that tore apart the familiar order of the sky. Too many worlds at once. Martha now stood before that exact same brightness. Every line was equally vivid, equally real. Charles who existed, and Charles who was never there. 7 sessions in the logs of an alternate line, while in her own memory, this was merely the first attempt. That other Martha, sitting on the floor beneath the processor, the one who had already understood something, and froze in that stillness with relaxed hands on her knees. And that small piece of paper hidden in the pocket of her work shirt, right over her left breast. Martha gently touched the paper through the rough fabric. Martha, Tom said softly. She opened her eyes. The man stood by the panoramic window of the operations bay. The window looked out onto the same stretch of forest as the glass in the cafeteria, but from this angle, one could also see the second row of pines, and behind them, the narrow line of the access road. At this hour, the entire area should have been plunged into absolute darkness, and the sky should have been only a shade lighter than the black silhouettes of the trees. The sky outside the window was bright. It was not dawn. It was far too early for dawn, far too late for dusk. It was a brightness of a completely different sort, diffuse, matte, entirely devoid of any visible light source. Martha walked up to the glass and stood right beside Tom's, shoulder to shoulder, both staring into the space beyond the glass. The pines in the first row stood in their place. Behind them, the second row of trunks stood out clearly, but further on, where the asphalt road was supposed to run, reality began to loop. Pines, more pines, another identical pattern of trunks, the same density of trees, the same repeating rhythm of branches. As if the forest in front of the station had been reflected in a giant mirror, which in turn reflected in another, creating an infinite geometric perspective of trees. With each successive reflection, the space grew slightly brighter, more distinct, an endless corridor of pines under a sky, stripped of stars, clouds, and any points of reference. Only that diffuse, quantum brightness. "You see it," Tom said. It was not a question. "The probability of coupling is 71%, Echon announced behind their backs. Martha stared at the trees growing out from inside other trees. "This is the answer I was looking for." The thought appeared in her mind uninvited. It was complete, strikingly calm. Martha noted it the same way she noted temperature fluctuations or cluster reconfigurations, as an undeniable fact. She felt no relief. She felt no disappointment. She simply accepted reality. All this time, she had been desperately searching for the boundary between the observer and the observed system. She had looked for the point where her own lifeline ended and the trajectory of someone else began. She had looked for a safety procedure that would tell her when to definitively abort a session to avoid erasing her own identity. And here, standing by the window with her hand pressed to her chest, over the piece of paper containing 5 words, she received the final answer. No boundary existed. Or it was too thin for any system to keep in check. The forker had never been a passive instrument for observing probabilistic lines. The forker irrevocably entangled those lines with the organism of its operator. Above 40%, no emergency protocol existed because there was no longer such a thing as a separate reality that could be shut down. All that remained was the observer, who had turned into a node, an observer whose only surviving line of defense was their own unique minutes. The ones lived physically, on their own skin, which no machine could strip away, because they did not reside in permanent logs. They existed solely in episodic memory, that shallow, flawed, error-prone, and wildly inefficient narrative, the only one truly her own. 74%, Echon announced. Shut it down, Martha said. Tom's understood the intention perfectly. He stepped to the console, and his hands were on the control panel before she could even finish her sentence. He performed a series of swift, practiced movements, initiating the hard power cut sequence. Martha heard every mechanical click of the switches, and every click sounded familiar to her. Echon went silent abruptly. The monitors began to go dark, not all at once. They shut off methodically, one by one, from the left side of the cluster. The last screen stayed lit for 3 long seconds, displaying a single rectangle with the red value of 76%. Then it, too, drowned in blackness. The operations room sank into deep gloom. Only a single emergency lamp above the airlock remained lit, casting a quiet, orange glow over the walls. The ventilation was still running. The smell of ozone slowly began to give way to the scent of dust and old plastic. Martha turned back to the glass. The pines outside the window were once again just ordinary pines. The diffuse brightness had vanished without a trace. The sky above the forest turned dark, familiar, stripped of unnatural depth. Tom stood by the console, looking at her sideways. The ceramic mug at his station was completely cold. "Will it stay?" he asked quietly, referring to the effects of the cascade. 76% is still a reversible value. Martha touched the cold steel of the panel with her finger one last time, and I do not intend to use it a 6th time. She left the room, heading straight for the emergency exit. Dawn was creeping over the station from the east, slowly and heavily, the way it does only in November, unhurried, as if not entirely sure it was welcome here. Martha pushed the heavy metal door and stepped directly onto the damp pine needles. Beneath her feet lay the same beige, rain-compressed mat. Every step was accompanied by the dull, soft rustle of the ground. The freezing air settled over the skin of her face in a thin, invigorating layer. A clear white plume of vapor rose from her mouth. Martha began to count her breaths steadily. 1, 2, 3, and the following inhalations. That simple exercise proved entirely sufficient to anchor her in reality. She walked deeper among the trunks. The pines were thick, as massive as human arms. The bark beneath her hand was dry, rough, cut by deep vertical fissures. She paused by the nearest tree and took a flake of bark between her fingers. The structure was hard, physically warmer than the surrounding air by a degree, maybe 2. Somewhere high above her head floated a light, sharp aroma of fresh resin. The wind came through the treetops first, that characteristic, mighty roar rolling through thousands of needles, traveling from east to west. Then came a second, of absolute pause. And only then did the gust strike near the ground, dry, cold, low, shifting the loose needles around her boots. Two completely different winds, just as she remembered. One for the canopy, the other for everything else. Martha sat down on a thick root that arched out of the earth in a broad curve. The wood was hard beneath her thighs, clearly noticeable through the rough fabric of her work trousers. She leaned her back against the pine trunk. The structure was stable, secure, enduring in this single place for 30 years, without any quantum doubts. She drew the paper from her shirt pocket. She unfolded it slowly, mindful of the creases, the tripartite fold, her own handwriting, the dark blue ink signifying a final conclusion. Do not use it a sixth time. She stared at those words for a long moment, then folded the paper in the exact same way and put it back. She began to calculate in her head. 4 minutes. That was the length of a single operational cycle. With 5 sessions recorded in the active protocol, that amounted to barely 20 minutes spent directly at the interface. Yet Echo memory did not record minutes. It encoded entire multi-hour blocks of time from alternate lines. Whole afternoons, evenings, and deep nights of those other versions of Martha who had sat on concrete floors, run analyses in black notebooks, and reconfigured the architecture of Echon at 4:47 in the morning. A dozen sessions, maybe several dozen, exactly as many as the written pages in the notebook, as the pink annotations in the binder. Each session meant 4 minutes of the station physical time, but each echo memory meant several hundred minutes of someone else's life that had seeped into her own motor skills, becoming her own body, her hand reaching for the switch, and the knowledge of the wrench lying behind her back. She multiplied the numbers in her head, a dozen iterations of several hundred minutes each. Somewhere around the 6th attempt, the absolute total crossed the threshold of 7,000. 7,000 minutes of another time grafted into her tissues. And her own untouched minutes, the ones she had lived personally without the forker. 38 years of life, exactly 20 million minutes. Each had existed only once. Each was indisputably her own. Each had left a physical mark on the same body that was now sitting on a pine root. 7,000 to 20 million. When she placed the numbers side by side, the proportions seemed absurdly small. Small, and yet terribly unsettling, like a tiny fragment wedged between the molars. Something that theoretically should take up no space, yet continuously distorts the entire environment. Still, it had been enough to make her choose the side corridor, because her motor memory knew the shortcut, enough to make her lose certainty about the number of attempts carried out. Enough for the coupling indicator to spark on its own, without the console, in the middle of the night while she slept soundly. The needles beside her shifted with a quiet rustle. Tom sat down on the same root, taking the empty spot to her right. He brought 2 camp mugs with him. He placed one carefully by her foot, right on the beige carpet of the forest. Hot steam rose from the vessel in a thin vertical spiral until a low gust of wind dispersed it just above the ground. The man did not drink his tea. He simply held the mug in his hands, staring into the distance. The wall of pines before them began to brighten rapidly from the east. The first golden pool of light broke through the thicket of branches, finding its angle. It was solitary, distinct, strikingly warm. Martha stared at that spot and waited. Half a minute, a full minute. One golden spot, only one. She leaned down and lifted the mug from the ground. The ceramic immediately yielded its warmth to her fingers. She took a sip of the brew. It was bitter, and at the same time far too sweet. Tom's, as usual, had added too much honey to the boiling water. She straightened her back, resting her elbows on her knees. Above their heads, the wind rolled through the pine canopy, a massive, sweeping drone that originated somewhere far to the east. And immediately after, a second later, the other gust struck, dry, low, entirely its own. All of it belonged to her. The two extreme temperatures on the surface of her face, the warmth of the morning sun, and the freezing chill of the shadow cast by the bulk of the station. The taste of poor tea with too much honey, the rough texture of the root beneath her thighs, and Tom's sitting beside her in absolute silence, holding the mug with both hands. 38 years, one specific life, and 20 million minutes that had no duplicate in the logs of any machine in the world. It was her property, only that, and that was entirely enough. Dawn stole between the trees slowly, without haste. The needles in the pine canopy turned golden branch by branch, the vector moving from east to west, while the morning sky lazily shifted from a dirty gray into pale pink. Martha observed the process without hurry, without any plan, outside of any operational protocol. One single line, her own, here and now. 7,000 minutes of foreign time lingered in her muscles, but this particular moment on the route was infinitely more real than all the alternative versions combined. Tom's finished his share. He set the empty mug down precisely between his foot and her boot, maintaining perfect symmetry in the pine needles. They sat in a silence that no longer required any artificial filling with words. Above their heads, a final strong gust of wind passed, only to die down 30 meters away among the thick trunks. And then what had to return returned. That low, stationary drone of the ventilation systems, audible even here, muffled by meter-thick reinforced concrete, layers of soil, bundles of cables, and acoustic insulation. The research station was operating in its steady, mechanical rhythm. The monitors remained off. Echon stayed in digital silence. The capacitor banks were slowly discharging. 76%. She knew she would eventually have to stand up, pick up the empty mug, return inside the building, and sit before the dark matrix of the console. She would look at that number and try to find a solution, or finally accept that nothing more could be done and work out a way to live with it. As with any mathematical constant that cannot be reduced to zero, but can only be weighed against other parameters, choosing whatever carries the highest stakes at any given moment, she certainly would not do it now. Right now, the only things that mattered were the hard root beneath her thighs, the warm tea, the carpet of withered pine needles, Tom sitting beside her, and the golden patches of light among the trunks. One at a time. She took the final sip. The ceramic pulsed with warmth for a moment, then began to cool in her hands as she moved the mug onto her knee. A single dawn, her own. No one could observe this single frame in her place.